Okay, so welcome to the deep dive, everybody. Our listener, you've given us some really interesting stuff to think about this week.
Yep.
Kind of scary stuff too, if we're being honest here. We're going to be looking at digital surveillance, privacy, in the digital age, really focusing on what your smartphone can actually do. We're drawing a lot from this interview with Edward Snowden. You know the guy. So our mission for this deep dive is to try to get like a clear picture of where we're at with mobile surveillance and really what that means for you, the person who's actually holding one of these things.
Well, this is a conversation that honestly could not be more relevant right now. As Snowden pointed out, things have changed a lot since 2013.
Right.
We've gone from a time when, pretty much all online activity happened on desktops, connected with wires, to, pretty much everything, starting with that phone that's in your pocket. It's a mobile-first world. So understanding, what these things can do, what they're doing, it's not just like an interesting, thought experiment anymore. It's something that, you need to know to, get through life today.
Yeah, absolutely. And to really make this clear for you, picture this. Your phone is probably right there, right, within reach. Maybe the screen's off. But have you ever really thought about what it's doing when you're not actually using it? It feels like it's just sleeping right. But according to Snowden, that's probably not true at all.
Yeah, that's the thing to understand right off the bat, right?
Mm-hmm.
Any smartphone, as long as it's on, is constantly trying to connect to something. It's reaching out to the closest cell tower. Even if the screen is off, it's still basically saying, hey, I'm here on the network. These things are built to be always connected.
He uses this really great analogy. He says, your phone is practically screaming into the air, hey, look at me. It's constantly sending out these unique ID codes. So what are these look at me signals, these digital ones?
So we're talking about two main identifiers. One is the IMEI. That stands for Individual Manufacturer's Equipment Identity. Basically, it's like a serial number, burned into your phone. It's tied to the physical device itself. And then you've got the IMSI, the Individual Mobile Subscriber Identity, which is on your SIM card. That's linked to your phone number. These are unique. No two phones are going to have the same IMEI and MSI combo active at the same time. Think of them like digital fingerprints that your phone is constantly leaving everywhere it goes. But unlike your actual fingerprints, these things are being broadcast, multiple times a minute. It's a constant trail.
So even if I take out my SIM card, and I put in a different one, the phone itself still has that original IMEI, that original hardware ID.
Exactly. The IMEI, that's like the phone's birth certificate, right? It identifies the actual hardware. The IMSI, that's like your subscription to the mobile network, your phone number, basically. And your phone, because it's always trying to stay connected, is always shouting both of these things to the cell towers around you.
And these cell towers, they have, as Snowden puts it, big ears. They're always listening. So what happens when a tower picks up on my phone's signal?
So every cell tower that hears your phone makes a note of it. Then they all kind of talk to each other, the towers in the area. Basically, they measure how strong your phone signal is to each of them. And by doing that, they can get a pretty good idea of your location, kind of like how GPS works with satellites, but with cell towers. So it creates this permanent log, this phone with this number connected to this tower at this exact time.
A permanent record of where my phone has been, which means probably me. That's a little creepy. So if I'm just walking my dog, phone's in my pocket, that's creating a little data point on some server somewhere.
Right. And because this location data is tied to those unique codes, the IMEI and MSI, it can easily be connected back to you in the real world. You pay for your mobile service, right? Or someone does, usually with a credit card or, something that can identify you. Even when you're using Wi-Fi at home, that activity is still linked to the device that always connects to your home Wi-Fi.
Right. Because my phone's movements, they become unique to me. It goes to my house every night, to my work during the day. Not everyone's phone is doing that. It's like a digital trail of breadcrumbs, like Hansel and Gretel.
That's it exactly.
Yeah.
Your phone's movements basically mirror your movements as a person.
No.
And those patterns, they tell a story, your commute, the people you visit, where you hang out. It all adds up to a really detailed picture of your life, your habits, even who you associate with.
Okay, so that's the network connection side of things, the always-on part. But Snowden also talks about apps, and it sounds like they're even more active in this whole data collection thing.
Yeah, they're definitely more active. So the network connection, that's kind of like a baseline level of tracking.
Yeah.
But the apps you have on your phone, they can collect data much more often, and sometimes with way more accuracy. Think about the notifications you get. Your phone is constantly chatting with servers to check for emails, social media updates, all that. And as Snowden says, Platforms like Facebook, they often know where you are, even if you haven't actually opened the app in a while.
And that's happening through location services, GPS, obviously. But there's also something I found really interesting, how Wi-Fi access points can be used for tracking.
Yeah, so your phone is constantly scanning for Wi-Fi networks, right? Just like every phone has that globally unique identifier, every Wi-Fi access point has one too. And these Wi-Fi signals, they're being mapped all the time. Think about those Google Street View cars driving around. They're not just taking pictures, they're also logging the exact location of every Wi-Fi network they find. So your phone is basically reporting its location to this giant invisible map all the time.
So even if I turn off the GPS on my phone, but keep the Wi-Fi on, apps can still figure out where I am just by seeing what Wi-Fi networks my phone sees.
Yep. By checking those unique Wi-Fi signals and comparing them to huge databases of Wi-Fi locations, they can get a surprisingly accurate location, even indoors where GPS might not work well. It's a really sophisticated way of tracking where you are, and it's always running.
This is starting to feel a little overwhelming, to be honest. So what can we do to limit this? Obviously, turning off my phone screen isn't enough. What about actually turning the whole thing off?
Well, in theory, yeah, turning it off should stop most of this. But Snowden brings up this issue with modern phone batteries. They're all sealed up, right? You can't take them out. With older phones, you could take the battery out, and you knew for sure it was completely off, not sending anything.
He even mentions like spies using those old phones, the ones with removable batteries. He calls them drug dealer phones because you could physically disconnect them and be sure you weren't being tracked.
That's right. But now, with these sealed batteries, it's possible, though not super likely for most people, that a phone could be hacked to look like it's off, when it's actually still running quietly in the background, maybe still listening or sending data. Snowden himself, he uses Faraday cages to block all those signals. But he says it's really tough to stay ahead of these super advanced threats, even for someone like him.
So for most of us, it's not that our phones are secretly being turned on. The bigger problem is that they're always on by default, and we don't really know what they're doing.
That's Snowden's main point. Users have no idea what the hell is going on with their phones most of the time. Whether you're on iOS or Android, it's really difficult for the average person to see and control all those network connections happening in the background. It's the operating system, the apps, all this stuff.
He talks about wanting to give apps speaking privileges. Like, we should be able to control who they talk to and when. Can you explain that a bit more?
So imagine you're using, say, Instagram. You want it to connect to Instagram's servers. Right, so you can see posts, send messages, all that. But you probably don't want it constantly talking to those ad networks or analytics trackers, the ones that follow you around the internet. Snowden's idea is that you should be able to control this very specifically. Like you can say, okay, this app can talk to these servers, but not those ones. It would give you a lot more control over your data and your privacy.
That makes a lot of sense. Like, my weather app, I want it to get the forecast, but why does it need to keep talking to different servers after that? It feels like these connections are hidden from us on purpose.
And that's no accident, according to Snowden. This whole industry is built on collecting data, and a lot of it happens without you knowing. What we really need is more transparency, so we can actually see what our devices are doing. And then we need controls that are easy to use, so we can manage all that.
He even mentions this idea of a do what I want but not spy on me button. It's like a dream feature for our phones.
I know, right? It does sound kind of utopian. But it shows how little control we actually have over privacy on our phones. The tech companies, they often say that giving us more control would be too risky or that it would confuse people. But Snowden says if the system is so complex that giving people basic privacy control is confusing, then the whole system needs to be redesigned. It needs to be built with privacy in mind from the ground up.
It's like he's saying our phones are so complicated now, we'd need to be like tech experts just to control who they're talking to. That's not realistic for most people.
No, it's not. He compares it to like running a huge organization. It shouldn't be that hard to have some basic privacy on your phone.
Yeah.
And this lack of transparency and control, it feeds into this whole problem of our data becoming so valuable to companies.
Right. Snowden says our personal data became this valuable thing that corporations buy and sell before we even understood what was happening.
Yeah. They realized how much money they could make by collecting and analyzing all our digital stuff.
Yeah.
Location history, browsing habits, social media, everything. And by the time we started realizing what was going on, it was already a huge part of how these companies operate. It's hard to fight against now.
And this connects to his worries about the permanent record and mass surveillance, right?
Absolutely. He says this massive data collection, it wasn't an accident. Governments and corporations, they both benefit from keeping it all hidden from us. The old way of doing surveillance, it was targeted. It took a lot of effort and you needed a good reason. Like you actually had to send someone to tap a phone line.
Like that example he gives of needing to send an FBI agent with tools to tap a phone, that's a lot of work.
Yeah. But with digital tech, surveillance could become way broader. It's like a giant net catching everything. Governments call it bulk collection. The idea is to collect everything now and sort through it later. They figure something useful will turn up. And this change from targeted to mass surveillance, it was hidden on purpose, Snowden says, through government secrecy and companies being sneaky with those long, confusing terms of service agreements, the ones we all just click agree on without reading.
And those terms, he points out, can change anytime the company wants. They don't even need to tell us, so even if we did read them once, the rules could be totally different now.
It shows how unbalanced things are. And
Yeah.
it leads into this whole legal thing that makes a lot of this data collection possible, the third-party doctrine. Do you want to explain that a bit?
So the third-party doctrine, it comes from the Supreme Court case back in the 70s, Smith v. Maryland. It was about a guy making harassing phone calls. The police, they got his phone records from the phone company without a warrant. And the court said those records belong to the company, not the guy making the calls.
That's the basis of the doctrine. Because the information was held by a third party, the phone company, the court said the individual didn't have a right to privacy in that information. So the police didn't need a warrant.
And the government has used this idea for the internet, too. They say that because all our data is stored by companies, our emails, our location history, our browsing, we don't have a right to privacy in any of it.
Exactly. So this legal thing basically gives these companies ownership over all this sensitive data about us. And it's what the government uses to get access to this information without a warrant. Snowden really emphasizes that this isn't just about abstract data. It's about people's lives being tracked and analyzed and maybe even manipulated without them knowing.
It's kind of scary when you think about it that way. And it makes that quote from John Perry Barlow that Snowden mentions really stand out. You can't awaken someone who's pretending to be asleep. It's like, how do you fix these problems when the people in power don't even want to admit they exist?
That's the big challenge. How do we get more privacy and control over our information when the whole system's working against us?
So the bottom line for you, our listener, is this. Your smartphone, even when it looks like it's off, is talking all the time. It's making a record of where you go, who you connect with, basically a record of your life. And a lot of this is happening without you even realizing it. What does privacy even mean anymore?
Right. With all this going on in the background, it makes you wonder, is true digital privacy even possible in the age of smartphones? It's a question we all need to think about.
Absolutely. We encourage you to think about the apps you use, the permissions you give them, maybe do some research, see what your digital footprint looks like. This deep dive is just the beginning. There's a much bigger conversation to be had about online privacy, surveillance, what it all means for us as individuals and for society. Thanks for listening.
Thanks for joining us.
We'll see you next time for another deep dive.